to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. Our guest today is Julie Gregory. Julie's an incredible lady. I've met her over the past year in a variety of events and gatherings. Julie learned that she was ApoE4 homozygote. That means she has 2 copies of the high-risk gene for developing Alzheimer's. If you have 2 copies, according to some evidence, there's up to a 90% chance that somebody will end up developing Alzheimer's in their lifetime. That means it's much, much, much more likely that they'll get Alzheimer's than they won't. On the cusp of Julie's 50th birthday, she started experiencing symptoms of cognitive decline and memory, and she'll probably talk about that a little bit. Since then, she's done an incredible amount of work on her own brain and body and has taken this to the next level and co-founded a website called apoe4.info, which I understand also has sort of a nonprofit wing now supporting research. Julie is trained as a marriage and family therapist and is now transferring many of those advocacy skills into the E4 population, connecting researchers and carriers of the allele, and is doing all types of interesting stuff. I've seen Julie speak in public. She is incredible. Thank you for being here, Julie.
Oh, thank you, Nate.
Recently, one of these gatherings, we were swapping stories of memory loss and really, frankly, how terrifying this can be. Can you kind of take us back to those early days when you started getting symptoms? I mean, and that, if I have it right, it was around your 50th birthday, which seems, quote unquote, young.
Definitely. It's funny. I was overall not well at that time. I was experiencing a lot of chronic illness, and I wasn't aware that I was experiencing cognitive decline. That wouldn't have been my primary symptom. But once I participated in 23andMe and learned I was an ApoE4 homozygote, and I began to delve into the implications of that, I thought, oh, this might be really significant, because I was experiencing symptoms of cognitive decline, but I just attributed it to my fast-paced life and to perimenopause. Never in a million years would I have thought of Alzheimer's.
Wow. So, I mean, how did you kind of think, oh, I have cognitive issues, I have brain issues, certainly many people, certainly women and even men that are going through that decline in hormones at 40s, 50s, 60s experience this. When did you kind of realize, oh my gosh, there's a bigger issue here?
Well, as I was saying, once I learned I was an ApoE4 homozygote, that really drove everything home for me. But looking back at the years preceding that, there were so many symptoms. And some were very subtle. I had been a lifelong reader and reading 2-3 books a week easily. It's like that was my pleasure in the evenings. I would fall asleep reading a book. Mm. Well, over the past couple of years before the cognitive decline began, I stopped reading as much because I had a hard time remembering the plot, the characters, a sentence that I had just read. Reading for pleasure wasn't pleasurable, so I stopped. I have some pretty dramatic examples. I remember driving home from work one day. I was on a very familiar road, one I had been on thousands of times before, and I was at a stoplight. And I looked around, and it only lasted for a second or two, but I had no idea of where I was.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was pretty terrifying.
Yeah, it is. It's frightening.
Yeah. Around that time, I also began running into people in the town where I lived for the past 20 years. And these people would approach me in public, and they would seem to know me very well. And in a couple of instances, I had no idea of who they were. That was scary.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, I mean, uh, many people tell me that when they're first going through this, they don't. This is not like something we talk about with our friends. It's maybe if we're lucky to have a real supportive spouse, we can talk about this with our real tight inner circle. But most people,
Sure.
it's not like they're going to go out and talk with their girlfriends or guy friends, and they're not just going to go out and talk about this.
No, this was something I was kind of sweeping under the rug. If I didn't learn about my ApoE4 homozygote status, I never would have taken such a deep dive into my own brain health and what I could do to remediate things. So, in so many ways, it was such a positive experience for me. I have to say, I was traumatized, deeply traumatized at the beginning, as many people are when they first learn. But here, 5 years later, I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah, that's interesting because you mentioned the 23andMe, which of course people can get their access to their own data. And I was taught kind of in my training and geriatrics training, and that getting your ApoE4 status outside of a research experiment was sort of a no-no, just because it was considered like traumatic. Like, if you're a
Right,
homozygote and you have two copies, there's nothing you can do, and it's a death sentence, and it just causes
right.
anxiety for people, and it's unethical to do it, and of course that's been discussed extensively. But I just don't no longer believe that there's nothing people can do about it. In fact, I'm starting to observe, and I haven't published on this, and we talk about this regularly with other kind of clinicians around that are doing this sort of thing. But it almost seems like some of the people that are ApoE4 one or two copies almost respond better to some of the treatments that we're sort of discovering now.
Exactly. And the more strategies you can put together, the better response our population seems to have. It's like one strategy isn't going to do much for an ApoE4 carrier. But when you combine 3, 4, 5, you see pretty dramatic results.
Interesting. So interesting. So I've heard you talk about your regimen, Julie. It's it's incredible. It's not for the faint of heart, for sure.
Well,
Um, but your spirit to get better and stay at the top of your game is just it has many of us that watch you speak marveling. Can you kind of go through your what you've learned as a result of knowing that you're ApoE4 4 and what you kind of do on a day-to-day basis, and how your practice of self-care has sort of evolved, like what you discovered first and then this, and kind of how you've
sure.
added to this?
Sure, it's funny, and I'm constantly tweaking it based on what I'm learning. So my protocol today may be different than my protocol tomorrow. And it's important for your listeners to understand everyone's protocol is going to be unique. So a lot of people won't have to be as strict as I have to be, but with a personal and family history and my high genetic risk, I guess I'm pretty strict as far as my protocol.
Why do you say everybody's protocol will be different? Because when we think about, you think about medications, well,
Sure,
if you have heart failure, you go on 4 medications. You have diabetes, you go on 1 to 2 medications. It's like, and really just
sure.
it's a dose difference, but it's not like many things. Like you do dozens of things. And why would everybody's be different? We've spoken about this in other podcast episodes, but from your
Sure.
perspective, why should protocols be different?
I think, well, number one, there is a dose difference. For instance, I fast 16 or more hours a day. People who carry one copy of ApoE4 or none may only have to fast for 12 hours a day. So that's a dose difference. In terms of otherwise individualizing it, I have learned that Babesia Duncani, a Lyme disease co-infection, is one of the drivers of my disease. So that's something that I address that other people don't have to address. So you need to identify what the drivers are of your pathology and then address them. So everyone's protocol is going to be a little bit different. But I think in
What
general, what I do could apply to most people. They just don't have to take it to the nth degree.
So what are the most sort of effective strategies that you find, 5 or 6 of the most important things you found really where on days, even when on days where you're not doing them, or if you
Right.
go on vacation or something like that, where you really notice a difference?
It's funny, Nate, even when I'm on vacation, I'm still practicing the protocol. The benefits I get from it are so tremendous. Why would I want to stop? But
Right.
the things that I find to be most effective, first and foremost, is exercise. I
Yeah.
exercise for about an hour a day. And I used to do really intense exercise. I was into this boot camp style training where I would really push myself. And
Hmm.
as an ApoE4 homozygote, that probably isn't the best thing. So now I just do this thing where I walk and I intersperse that with some running when I feel like it. And I listen to meditative music, and it's amazing. It's time that I spend outside every single day. I find it very restorative. And if there's a day I don't exercise, I feel different. So that's one of my most important things. Other than that, I think a super clean diet is extremely important.
So super clean, cutting out processed foods. Other than, cutting out processed foods is one thing that's
Sure.
non-controversial. I mean, like nobody's going to argue
Right.
with cutting out, high processed flours and sugars and things that sit on shelves for months at a time. Besides for sort of the obvious, I mean, there's the Mind diet, there's the Mediterranean diet, there's a ketogenic diet, there's numerous diets. What
Right.
are the kind of the core elements that you have found, and those that you talk with that are ApoE4 that are finding that are the most sort of effective as a collective?
Sure. For me, I don't eat any grains whatsoever. I learned I was gluten intolerant. And so cutting out gluten and all grains has been extremely helpful for me. I used to have widespread body pain, and that's completely gone.
Mm.
So instead of grains, I eat a lot of vegetables, organic, locally sourced when possible, colorful, every color of the rainbow, and non-starchy. I eat some starchy vegetables like sweet potatoes for the beta carotene. I also eat a lot of healthy fats, and I choose to focus primarily on plant fats. We're finding that ApoE4 carriers don't do as well with animal fats. They tend to really exaggerate our advanced lipids. So my diet is mildly ketogenic, but I'm using primarily monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats in whole foods. And I eat just enough animal protein that's very cleanly sourced and high in omega-3s. And when I eat like that, I feel amazing.
Yeah, I do too. I probably everybody so far, exercise. And what's interesting though, what you mentioned, sort of the low to moderate intensity as opposed to the high intensity.
Right,
And then, of course, there was big news this weekend about coconut oil, the American Heart
right.
Association, and
Yeah,
saturated fats. And of course, that's a plant-based product. And
sure.
there are cultures around the world, not the American culture, but cultures around the world that consume more than probably half their diet in coconut fats. Have you incorporated MCT oil, coconut fats? Mary Newport has made, there's numerous people, Mary Newport probably
Right.
most famously treating her husband with Alzheimer's using MCT oil. Do you have thoughts on the use, for better, for worse, or no different, on MCT oil, coconut oil, and those types of products?
Sure. I think coconut oil and MCT oil play a very important role in helping to remediate cognitive decline. ApoE4 carriers especially begin to exhibit reduced cerebral glucose utilization. We do as early as our 30s. And so it means we can't use glucose, which is a primary fuel in Western society, very effectively. And so ketones can create this alternative brain fuel that can take the place of the glucose. So I find it very helpful to be in mild ketosis. I think we need more studies regarding coconut oil and MCT oil to gauge the effect on heart health. I don't think the studies are there right now. I think it's extremely important to use when you have any symptoms of glycotoxicity or cognitive decline. But for me, as I've healed, my glycotoxicity and my cognitive decline has improved. I'm instead focusing more on monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and some limited saturated fat. I'm using less, and only because ApoE4 carriers have a very exaggerated response to saturated fat, even coconut oil.
Absolutely. So I'm so happy to hear you say that. It sort of confirms some of the things that we see, which is, using something like a mild ketosis or a ketogenic diet, almost like short-term, therapeutically.
Exactly.
And to sort of bring things back to normal. And once it's normalized, there's no reason it's a very extreme diet.
Well, you
And
know what, Nate? I don't know. I don't find it very extreme. And I use the coconut oil transiently during the worst of my symptoms. And as I've healed, I've switched to other fats to stay in mild ketosis. So I'm still in mild ketosis. And I don't find it extreme. Practice the way I do. I'm eating 10, 12 cups of non-starchy veggies a day. I mean, it's a lot of food. So I don't feel carb limited. I think because
yes.
the fiber's so high.
Yeah.
So I'm still using a ketogenic diet.
Well, it's modified. I mean, it sounds like it's
Yes,
modified. I mean, ketogenic diet meaning 90% of your food from fats. I mean, that's pretty
definitely
tough.
not. I'm not there. Yeah.
Yeah. So diet, exercise for
Mhm.
sure. That's amazing information. What other things have you found that have been really sort of transformational or at least important in keeping you well?
I think optimizing sleep is so important. As you probably know, ApoE4 is the ancestral allele. And early, being a carrier of that ancestral gene, we're not very well suited to all these bright artificial lights late at night. So I use my blue blocker glasses 3 hours before I go to bed to help me ramp up melatonin production. And I take certain supplements before I go to sleep. I sleep in a room that's cool, perfectly dark, so that light doesn't interfere with melatonin production. If I have any electronic devices in my room, I've got the Wi-Fi turned off. I like to read on my iPad, but I've got like a yellow skin that I put on that to block artificial light. I mean, there's so many tricks that I use to optimize my sleep, and it's amazing. I mean, it's so restorative. I don't function well if I don't get at least 7 or 8 hours of good sleep. And on a regular basis, before I implemented this protocol, that was kind of my norm. And now I sleep fabulously and I wake up feeling really, really good.
Wow. So you really learned kind of an amazing amount just about your own self.
Right.
These are things that are like widely applied to almost everybody. What do you take supplement wise before you go to bed?
Before I go to bed, I do progesterone. I do my melatonin. I do ashwagandha and Bacopa monieri. And all of those together give me very sound sleep.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So diet, exercise, sleep. I'm sure stress factors in somewhere. Stress shreds the brain, cortisol, I'm sure at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think stress reduction is right up there. For me, I've learned to meditate and I get a tremendous benefit from that. For people that are used to a hectic, fast-paced life, it's really hard at first to empty and clear your mind. But once you get into that habit and begin practicing every day on a regular basis, I found it to be so healing and so freeing. Just to sort of look at yourself as a neutral outside observer. It's something I really look forward to.
Yeah, I have to concur with that too, just on a personal level. We don't talk about this so much, but I'm not one so much for mind emptying meditation. I've tried it for many years and I had some interesting experiences on it. And I found actually that self-hypnosis and guided visualization really has almost the same effect. And I also had a period of time fairly recently, just in the last few months, where just because of some stuff that was happening at home, wasn't able to kind of I do it at work before I start work, seeing patients. I do it before then, and I have a spot that I go to, and it's like a chapel, and it's a great place. And I was a couple of days I wasn't doing it, and of course I'm more irritable, and I'm just not thinking right, and feeling more stressed, and it took a little bit of time. It took a few days to figure out what's different. It was really amazing. It is absolutely something that I can almost like not live without at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's probably the most underutilized strategy that we have. Anybody can do it at any time, but it's so underused. It's sad.
No patent.
Right, exactly. Right. And we have so much evidence that it actually changes your DNA. I mean, it's extremely strong strategy.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Anything else that you feel just from your own regimen that might be kind of widely applicable, or even in maybe narrowly to some people that, that with ApoE4, 440, anything else? So diet, exercise, sleep, stress, anything else that you
Oh
mentioned,
my
progesterone
gosh.
and some supplements?
Right. Yeah. There's so much that I do. I take impeccable care of my teeth. I think we have a lot of evidence that oral infections can be related to cognitive decline. So I do coconut oil pulling for about 10 minutes a day. And of course, coconut oil has antimicrobial properties. And it's something that I find very relaxing and healing. I take a tiny bit of coconut oil, I melt it in my mouth before I brush my teeth, and I just sort of swish and pull it around in my mouth for about 10 minutes. And I spit it out into like a wastebasket. Don't spit it in the sink because it will clog your pipes.
Sounds like you know.
Right? And then I brush with a non-fluoride toothpaste. Fluoride is a neurotoxin. I mean, there's so many nuances to my protocol. I avoid all toxins in my cosmetics and my toiletries. It's shocking how many damaging chemicals there are. And if you think about, we apply medications transdermally, and yet we're applying very toxic moisturizers and substances to our skin without giving it a thought. So I like to run all of my products against the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep database, so I can find the cleanest products out there.
Well, that's amazing. That's a great resource, the Environmental Working Group Skin Deep database.
Yeah.
Excellent. You mentioned Babesia Duncani, which is, of course, an infectious organism.
Right.
Chronic infections are very controversial in my medical community and kind of a mainstream medical community. Chronic infections are not really recognized. I mean, I say that, but they are, but not as much as they might be in sort of the social media or popular press. And I do think that some of these things are sort of overdiagnosed, and I'm still learning myself. But you and I both saw an amazing talk by Dr. Rudy Tanzi, who's probably one of the top 1 or 2 Alzheimer's researchers in the world, currently at Harvard at Massachusetts General Hospital. And he had this really elegant, really beautiful talk on infections, viruses and bacteria, all of which seem to lead to the protein beta amyloid, which of course we know is causally related to Alzheimer's.
Right.
You mentioned some experience with Babesia, and what are your feelings about chronic infections? What have you seen in yourself and others? And kind of, are people treating these things, and what are they seeing in terms of results?
It's funny that you share your community's impression. And I have to say, just being peripherally involved in the health world, I always thought things like chronic Lyme were just kind of out there. So I think I was as skeptical as anybody. And nobody was more shocked than me to learn that a Lyme disease co-infection may be driving much in many of my symptoms and chronic illnesses that I experienced throughout much of my adult life. But it was actually Dr. Dale Bredesen who pushed me to test for this, even though I was getting so much better by applying all these strategies. My immune system began to show signs of not working very well. So I had my immunoglobulins tested, and sure enough, they were extraordinarily low. My IgG was very low. So when I shared this information with Dr. Bredesen, he said, you have to get tested for CIRS. And CIRS stands for Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. I had not heard about it. I had read his paper about inhalational Alzheimer's disease and had a brief acquaintance with it. But I just refused to believe anything like that could apply to me because I'd already gotten so much better.
Right.
But he really pestered me because I dragged my feet. Because as you know, those tests are hard to get. They're very detailed. But he gave me a list of specific tests that he wanted me to have in different labs for each test. And I went ahead and finally got the testing done. Just to kind of appease Dr. Bredesen. I didn't think that they would find anything. And I was blown away by what they found. My first round of testing showed that my TGF beta 1 was 40,000. My
Yeah.
C4A was 15,000.
Yeah.
My
These are
alpha,
obviously, for our listeners that are not familiar, these are extremely, extremely high. These are
crazy.
10,
Right.
20 times the upper limit of normal on some of these
Right.
tests
My alpha MSH was, I think, 4
in the
initially.
tank.
And my HLA-DR-DQ haplotype pointed to a chronic Lyme infection. So I found a terrific doctor who specialized in Lyme with Dr. Bredesen's help, because as you know, finding physicians is very, very difficult. And
Yeah, I mean, we definitely don't treat the chronic Lyme just because it's
right.
just so difficult to diagnose, and it's
Oh
so
my
so
gosh.
controversial. And frankly, I really am not sure how I feel about it. But some of the we need more studies. But your experience is really sort of telling here.
Well, so I saw Dr. Sanjaya Shway at the California Center for Functional Medicine, and he specializes in Lyme and Lyme disease co-infections. And he ordered so many tests, I can't begin to tell you. I had vials and vials of blood and many other tests, and he found a lot of underlying issues. But one of the things that stood out the most was this Babesia Duncani. A regular test has a ratio of 1 to 256. Anything less than that is negative. And I was 1 to over 1,000. I think he'd never seen a test as highly positive as mine. So it was kind of our smoking gun. He also,
Can I just ask,
Sure.
do you live in an area where it makes sense that something like that would be transferred to you?
You know, I'm not sure when I got the bite. I've had many tick bites throughout my life. But I did have one in particular that had the bullseye rash big time. And I did take a round of antibiotics at that time, but only one week. And for somebody with my genetic susceptibility, that probably wasn't enough.
Yeah.
So I was going to mention Dr. Schweig also found a whole bunch of underlying GI issues, which is very common in SIRS. So, of course, I had to address all of that, as well as this Lyme disease co-infection. But by doing so, I feel so much better.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean,
What
I know.
specifically
So I was,
did you notice? Like, that's amazing.
I was as skeptical as you about SIRS, about chronic Lyme. And then I realized I put all the pieces together. This could have accounted for many of the chronic and severe illnesses that I'd had throughout much of my adult life.
Oh, wow. Then the other connection with, you mentioned some of the things you mentioned make me think of mast cell activation.
Right.
And that's also become something that you see sort of in the popular press. I mean, this is very well characterized in the hematology oncology literature.
Sure.
And I think you told me you had a story with a member of your family, and that kind of led you to discovering some things about yourself. And does this connect back to the brain and Alzheimer's story at all for you? The APOE4 story for you at all?
I don't know.
Cell activation?
I think you're probably seeing this same triad of symptoms or diagnoses that I was experiencing. I was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. Along with that, I was experiencing orthostatic intolerance. And along with that, I was experiencing mast cell activation. Interestingly, we see this.
Can you just give a brief thumbnail on mast cell activation when you say you were experiencing symptoms of mast cell activation?
Sure.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I was actually given the formal diagnosis of it. But basically, I was experiencing severe allergy symptoms, and I was found to have no IgE-mediated allergies. And my symptoms were severe enough that I used an EpiPen on 2 occasions.
Wow.
It was terrifying because I couldn't avoid my trigger because I didn't know what my trigger was. My trigger could be stress. It could be too hot, too cold. It could be a food that I ate yesterday I suddenly couldn't eat today. I mean, it was so elusive. It was terrifying.
Oh my gosh.
And I was going to mention that this triad of illnesses, the orthostatic intolerance, the connective tissue disorder, and the mast cell activation, we see it a lot in the APOE4 community. As far as, what its relevance is, I don't know. I've made Dr. Bredesen aware of it, and we're tracking it. but we've got almost 1,200 members now, and we've got a nice subset of our population that is dealing with this. I don't know what the connection is, but there's definitely a connection. And many of us have found that by treating the mast cell activation, by addressing our brain health, the mast cell activation greatly improves. So we don't understand why, but there's certainly some connection there.
Wow, that's a really interesting to be continued, and I'm sure I'll hear from you, and I'll probably follow up myself kind of down that rabbit hole. That's super interesting. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, just you and I have talked about kind of like what a touchy subject Alzheimer's and pre-Alzheimer's is. Of course, when you first started having symptoms, there's just not a lot of people that you're gonna not tell somebody you don't recognize who they are when you've known them for 20 years.
Right.
Or, I'm not going to say, of course I don't remember my address. But I have some pretty specific thoughts about like why this is such a touchy subject. Mostly, like I was telling you, like heart disease and cancer, these are things that there's so-called something to do about it. And with memory loss, like there's not supposed to be anything you can do about it. And your advocacy work is really, I think it's sort of first of its kind. Can you tell us about apoe4.info, which is a website, APO, that's APO, capital E, the number 4.info, like information, like what it is and how it got started and what it's sort of intended to do in terms of advocacy?
Sure. When I learned about my status over 5 years ago, I was traumatized. And I actually turned to the Alzheimer's Association looking for information about Alzheimer's. I thought, well, okay, I have this high susceptibility to Alzheimer's. Surely there's something I can do. And on their main page at that time, they told me that Alzheimer's was incurable, untreatable, it was progressive, and that most patients were dead within 10 years. They also told me it wasn't preventable. And that was terrifying to me. And I think the pervasiveness of that myth, and I do believe that's a myth now, is what causes the stigma that you were speaking about. And it's also a large part of why we created apoe4.info. I didn't want another person to learn of their genetic risk without having other people there to support them, without having accurate information. And basically, we're dedicated to understanding the ApoE4 gene, how it impacts health, and we do that in a variety of ways. We run an active forum and Facebook page, and we do a multitude of other things. We share a lot of information. We want to let people know that there's many things they can do to prevent the pathologies associated with this gene.
Can you give us an example of sort of how it's helped an individual or individuals or even yourself?
Oh, wow. I mean, this community has helped me tremendously. We sort of began on 23andMe. So back 5 years ago when 23andMe was revealing the health-related genetic information, there were people from all over the world who were learning they were ApoE4 carriers. And 23andMe provided forums where we could gather. And we basically began a conversation among hundreds of people, sharing information, supporting one another. We began analyzing every study we could get our hands on and dissecting it. We were all reaching out to various experts and sharing those opinions. And after a year or so, I realized we were sitting on a treasure trove of information. And that's when we got the idea of creating our own nonprofit and moving this away from 23andMe, because it was just one long continuous thread. The information wasn't searchable. And we wanted to organize the information. So that's why we branched off to our own nonprofit, our own website. I think we did that in October of 2013. And this community has helped to heal me, Nate. I think of them as family. And I think we've improved the cognition of many, many of our members. We hold regular annual meetups, and we're going to have one in San Diego later this year. But When we meet these people face to face for the first time, it's like meeting long lost brothers and sisters. We have this instant connection. Nobody knows the fear of living with this risky gene like someone else who's experiencing the same thing. And it's been a very, very powerful experience.
Absolutely.
To interact with this amazing group.
Yeah, crowdsourcing. I mean, it's like crowdsourcing at its best. It's really like not only just knowledge sharing, but also sharing heart, feelings, and this whole spiritual component here, which is just amazing.
Absolutely. And I think it's really powerful when you put 1,200 people together who have skin in the game. I think,
and are smart. A lot of these people are super smart.
Right. We've got scientists, we've got physicians, and we're putting it together, and we're figuring out what strategies work, what strategies don't. People are running their own N=1 experiments and reporting on them, and we're interacting with lots of researchers, and we've made so much progress. I'm so confident now that Alzheimer's, by and large, for the most part, can be prevented. And I think it's our job now to disseminate that information. And the earlier we begin practicing these prevention strategies, the better.
What a message.
Everyone agrees the pathology that leads to Alzheimer's starts a decade or more before the first symptom shows. So if you're a 20-year-old, if you're a 10-year-old who's an ApoE4 carrier, you need to begin practicing these strategies as early as possible. There's so much we can do.
Cut out the sugar.
Exactly.
Out the sugar early.
Protect your brain.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
So that's just a phenomenal message. Can anyone get an account with apoe4.info, or is there is there like a vetting process that needs to go on?
We do have a little vetting process. We've had some scammers try to get on the site.
Trolls.
So, right, yeah. The only vetting we do is your first 3 posts are moderated before they show up. So we try to find people who are sincere. And you don't have to be an ApoE4 carrier to participate. By and large, most people are. But we've got lots of people who are not ApoE4 carriers, and they work with our community because we're one of the only sites out there that's working to prevent Alzheimer's.
Yeah, amazing. I think there'll be more. Maybe there'll be nothing like yours, but I think you've started something that's really extremely valuable, and I encourage everybody to at least check it out and get an account and see what they're doing. It's remarkable. Hey, Julie, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you, and your story is just so powerful, and the advocacy work that you're doing has amplified your story and the stories of of so many people like you, and it's just amazing how much it's helping everybody.
Oh, thank you, Nate, and thank you for the opportunity to spread our message.
Absolutely. So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.